The 37th woman stepped away from the stone, and the only sound in the judgment hall was the whisper of her hymn across the tiles. Nothing again, nothing. I let my breath leave slowly through my teeth and kept my face still. 300 years the moonstone had lain in the floor of Glenrath's judgment hall, a pale disk of ancient quartz the width of a war shield, set flush with the limestone by Aldwin, the first alpha of my bloodline. Every Luna in our recorded history had woken it. My great-grandmother had pressed her palm to its face on the night she was claimed, and the stone had turned gold from edge to edge, warm as a hearth, and had not dimmed until the morning she died. 3 centuries, then cold, gray, silent. Every alpha king between her time and mine had tried to wake it with his chosen mate, and everyone had knelt on the same limestone and risen again with the same empty hands. That concludes the Highborn Register, Your Grace. Lord Rathwell's voice fell from the gallery rail above me, clipped and meticulously portioned. He was the kind of man who rationed even his syllables, as though each one were drawn from a limited account. There are additional names, lower service roles. I did not look up at him. I was watching the stone, that pale, stubborn circle in the floor, catching the torchlight and giving back nothing. Run them. A pause. Rathwell's quill scratched once against his ledger. Your Grace, the remaining candidates are kitchen staff, stable hands, and, he turned a page, a die worker. I would note that the efficacy of this exercise with persons of no standing is. Run them, Rathwell. Another scratch of the quill. He said nothing further. I sat back in the judgment chair, carved limestone, older than the keep itself, cold enough to feel through my cloak, and let my gaze track across the empty hall. The torches had burned low. The court had stopped attending the trials a week ago. Even the curious had grown bored of watching women kneel on a dead stone and rise with nothing to show for it. Lady Orana had been the last to leave the gallery, 3 days prior, after her own turn at the stone had produced exactly what every other turn had produced. She had handled it with the particular grace of a woman who had already been told by 6 council members that the stone was a relic of no relevance, and that the political match, her, was what mattered. She had smiled at me on her way out. I had not smiled back. My wolf stirred. He had been restless for months, not raging, not ill, just restless in the way of an animal that scents whether it cannot name, pacing behind my ribs at odd hours, lifting his head when I passed certain corridors. It was his restlessness that had driven me to revive the trial in the first place. No Alpha King had attempted the Moonstone test in 4 generations. My own father had called it sentiment. But my wolf would not settle, and I had learned in 31 years of carrying him that when he paced, something was coming. I simply had not expected it to take 37 failures to arrive. The first of the lower service candidates entered through the east door, a broad-shouldered kitchen girl who looked more frightened of the hall than of the stone. I rose from the chair, because it felt wrong to sit above them for this, and stood at the edge of the torchlight with my hands behind my back. Your name, I said. Bess, Your Grace. She curtsied badly, which I did not hold against her. Curtsies were not in a kitchen girl's training. Press your hand to the stone, Bess. Take your time. She knelt and pressed. The stone stayed cold. I thanked her, and she left quickly, and I did not blame her for that either. After Bess came Aneth, a laundress, then Fay, who worked the stables, then a girl whose name I did not catch because she whispered it, and who bolted from the hall the moment the stone did not respond. Then 2 more kitchen workers, a chandler's apprentice and an elderly seamstress named Dorcas, who knelt with such difficulty that I crossed the hall and helped her stand again, and who patted my arm and said, "Well, it was worth the walk, Your Grace, if only for the look on Lord Rathwell's face." I glanced up at the gallery. Rathwell's expression could have been carved from the same limestone as the walls. The list thinned. Names I did not know, faces I had never seen, women who worked in the lowest levels of my own keep and whom I had failed, apparently, to notice. Each one knelt, pressed, rose, left. The stone stayed gray. My wolf paced and would not explain himself. "Two remaining, Your Grace," Rathwell said from above. His voice had taken on the particular flatness of a man who wished to be elsewhere. The next woman was a scullery maid. She touched the stone and nothing happened, and she curtsied better than Bess and left. "Last name," Rathwell said, and I heard the faint relief of a man reaching the bottom of his ledger. "Wren, dye worker, no family name recorded." The east door opened, and she came in. She was small. That was the first thing, not frail, but compact in the way of someone who had learned to take up as little room as possible. Dark hair pulled back and tied with a strip of plain cloth. Gray eyes that moved across the judgment hall with a calm, steady attention, as if she were cataloging the stonework and the torchlight and the placement of every shadow. She wore the dye worker's plain linen, washed many times, and her hands, I noticed her hands before anything else, were stained deep indigo from wrist to fingertip. Not dirt, not carelessness. The mark of her trade soaked into the skin, permanent as a tattoo. She stopped at the edge of the moonstone circle and looked down at it. "Your name is Wren," I said. "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice was low and steady. She did not curtsy, and I did not think it was defiance. I thought she simply had not been taught, and had enough self-possession not to attempt what she did not know. "Press your hand to the stone. Take as long as you need." She looked at me then, a direct, unhurried look, gray eyes meeting mine, and something in my chest shifted. Not the bond. Not yet. Something smaller and stranger. A feeling that I had seen those eyes before, or dreamed them, or carried their color behind my own lids without knowing it. My wolf stopped pacing. Wren knelt. She looked at the stone for a moment, studying it, I realized, the way she might study a length of cloth before cutting, and then she laid her right hand, palm down, against the quartz. 3 heartbeats. 3 heartbeats in which the world held its shape, and the stone stayed gray, and I felt the silence of 300 years settle into the hall like sediment. Then the stone woke. Gold, not a flicker, not a glow, a flood. Light poured from the quartz as if a sun had been sleeping beneath the limestone floor and her hand had been the key that turned in the lock. The color ran from the center of the stone outward, filling the pale disk edge to edge, and the warmth hit me across 10 paces of open hall, warm as a lit hearth, warm as summer on the River Glen, warm as something I had not felt since I was a boy standing in my great-grandmother's presence, and being told that the stone remembered every Luna who had ever lived. It remembered. The torches guttered. The gold light climbed the walls, caught the ancient carvings above the gallery rail, poured through the high east window, and turned the dust motes in the air to sparks. And the bond struck. I have heard other alphas describe the mate bond as a collision, a door smashed open, a wall brought down. That is not what happened to me. What happened was quieter and more devastating than any collision. I had carried a melody in my chest my whole life. Not a song anyone had taught me, a wordless thing. A hum I found myself falling into during long watches and silent rides. 4 notes that rose and fell and rose again and never resolved. I had assumed it was nothing. A habit of my own heartbeat. When the stone woke under Wren's hand, the melody found its lyric. The 4 notes completed themselves. They became a line, and the line became a verse, and the verse was her name, her face, her gray eyes, the indigo on her fingers, the steadiness of her kneeling form. The melody I had hummed my whole life had been waiting for her, and now it was finished, and I understood what my wolf had been pacing toward for months. She was mine, not in possession, in destination. She was where the melody had always been going. Wren lifted her head. The gold light caught her face, and I saw that she felt it too, not the melody perhaps, but the warmth, the rightness, the sudden impossible sense of a key slotting home. Her lips parted. Her stained fingers pressed harder into the stone as if she were holding on. "Your Grace," Rathwell's voice came from above, stripped of its usual calibration. I heard his ledger hit the gallery floor. Your Grace, the stone it has not in 300. I was already moving. I crossed the judgment hall in 6 strides. The gold light pooled around my boots, and I felt the stone's warmth through the soles. Wren was still kneeling, both hands on the quartz now, her face turned up toward me, and I read in her expression not fear but a vast, startled understanding, the look of someone who has just been told the answer to a question she did not know she had been asking. I knelt, not beside her, before her. I, Aldrich of Glenrath, Alpha King, Lord of the River Valley and the Limestone Heights and every wolf who ran beneath the glen's cold sky, knelt on the warm stone in front of a dye worker with no family name, and I took her indigo-stained hand, and I said the only words that mattered. The stone knows you, my wolf knows you, and I know you. You are my Luna. You are what 300 years of silence were waiting for. Her fingers were rough with work and stained past any scrubbing, and they were the most important thing I had ever held. I am a dye worker, she said, not an argument, a fact offered the way one offers a stone to be weighed. I know. My hands are stained. I looked down at our joined hands, mine pale, hers indigo, and said, they woke the moonstone. I would not trade them for any other hands in this kingdom. The gold light held. The stone hummed beneath us, a low, steady vibration I could feel in my knees and my chest and the roots of my teeth. Above us in the gallery, I heard Rathwell pick up his ledger, set it down, and pick it up again. Wren looked at the stone, then at me, and her gray eyes were clear. All right, she said. It was not a surrender. It was a decision made by a woman who had weighed the facts and found them sound. I would learn in the days that followed that this was how Wren did everything. The council met within the hour. I had expected resistance. I had not expected the particular flavor of it, not outrage but a kind of pained bewilderment, as though I had announced that a river had begun to flow uphill, and they were being asked to build their roads accordingly. A dye worker, Your Grace. Lord Rathwell stood at the head of the council table with his ledger open, as if the written record might change the outcome. The stone has been dormant for 3 centuries. We cannot rule out a natural phenomenon, mineral resonance, a shift in the underground springs. The stone was placed by Aldwin, I said. It has never responded to mineral resonance. It responds to a Luna. With respect, it responded to Lunas 300 years ago. The conditions are unchanged. A woman touched the stone woke. The bond struck, my wolf confirmed. Silence. Around the table, 6 council members studied their hands, their wine, the grain of the oak. Lord Brannock, the oldest among them, cleared his throat and said nothing and then cleared it again. Lady Orina was not on the council, but she was in the room. She had arrived before the council members, which told me she had been informed before I had summoned anyone, which told me she had sources in the household staff faster than Rathwell's ledger. She stood by the window in a gown of dark green, her auburn hair immaculate, her expression composed into a mask of polite interest that did not reach her eyes. No one questions the bond, Your Grace, she said. Her voice was pleasant and measured. But the Luna rite exists for a reason. A single trial conducted in an empty hall with no witnesses is not confirmation. The rite requires a public test. The stone must answer before the full court. Surely you would want that certainty for your own Luna. She was right, and she knew it, and I did not like that she was right because I could hear the calculation beneath the courtesy. Orina did not expect the stone to answer a second time. She expected it to stay dark, and Wren to be quietly set aside, and the political match to proceed as planned. The Luna rite will be held, I said, on the new moon as tradition requires. Orina inclined her head. Then we have nothing but patience to offer, Your Grace. I dismissed the council. Rathwell lingered, ledger under his arm, and said, Quarters have been prepared for the candidate in the East Wing. Her name is Wren. A pause. Quarters have been prepared for Wren in the East Wing, Your Grace. See that she has everything she needs. And Rathwell, she is not a candidate, she is my Luna. The right is a formality. His expression did not change. As you say, Your Grace. I found her in the East Wing quarters that evening. The rooms were large and largely unfamiliar to her. I could see that in the way she stood near the window rather than sitting in the chair, as though she did not yet have permission to use the furniture. Someone had laid out a gown of pale blue on the bed, finer than anything she had likely owned, and she had not touched it. She was still in her dye-worker's linen, her stained hands folded in front of her, watching the River Glen slide past below the window in the last copper light of the day. You don't have to stand, I said from the doorway. She turned. I know I am choosing to. I almost smiled, almost. May I come in? It is your keep, Your Grace. It is, but these are your rooms, so I am asking. Something shifted in her face, a small thing, a softening around her eyes that I would come to recognize as Wren's version of surprise. She was not a woman who was accustomed to being asked. Come in, she said. I sat in the chair she had not used. She stayed by the window, and I let her, because I understood instinctively that Wren required space the way a wild animal requires space, not because she would bolt, but because she needed to know the exit was open. Tell me about the dye work, I said. She studied me. Why? Because it is your life, and I know nothing about it, and I would like to. Another flicker of that softening. She sat not in the other chair but on the window ledge, her back against the stone, her stained fingers laced in her lap. Indigo is the hardest dye to set, she said. Most colors you can fix with heat or with salt. Indigo requires reduction. You have to strip the oxygen from the bath before the cloth will take the color. It turns green in the vat. You think you have done it wrong. Then you lift the cloth into the air, and the oxygen returns, and the green becomes blue. The color only arrives when you trust the process. I watched her talk, and my wolf lay down inside me for the first time in months. Simply lay down, settled, closed his eyes, as if Wren's steady voice and her knowledge of oxygen and color were the answer to every question he had been pacing through my bones to ask. Who taught you? I said. Marin, the dye mistress. She took me in when I was 6. I had no family, none that claimed me at any rate. She needed an extra pair of hands, and I was small enough to reach the bottom of the vat. A faint, dry edge to her voice, not bitterness, the same steady practicality I had seen in the judgment hall. I learned to read from the dye recipes. Some of the older formulas are written in the old script, and Marin could not read them, so I taught myself. You read the old script. Enough to follow a recipe. I am not a scholar. I thought of the 37 highborn women who had touched the stone and left nothing behind. Women tutored in languages and diplomacy and dance. Women groomed for the Luna's chair. And I thought of Wren, who had taught herself the old script from the bottom of a dye vat. The stone made no mistake, I said. She looked at her hands. The indigo ran deep. It colored the lines of her palms, the crescents of her nails, the skin between her fingers. A lifetime stain. They will say it did, she said. Some will. For a while. And then the stone will answer again, and they will have nothing left to say. She met my eyes, and there it was, the melody, rising in my chest, completed and whole. 4 notes and a lyric, her name. You are asking me to believe in a stone, she said. I am asking you to believe in the bond. The stone is simply its witness. Wren was quiet for a long time. The copper light on the river faded to gray, and the first torches were lit in the courtyard below, and she sat on the window ledge with her stained hands in her lap and said nothing, and I did not press her, because I had told her the truth, and the truth required no additional argument. All right, she said again, the same word, the same weight, a decision, not a concession. I rose to leave. At the door I paused. The gown on the bed, I said. Wear it or do not. You are not required to become someone else. I will look at it, she said, but I will not scrub my hands. No, I said, do not. The days before the Luna Rite were not kind to her. I had expected open cruelty, insults, sabotage, the sharp-edged malice of a court that felt its order threatened. What I found was worse, a suffocating, airless indifference. The court did not attack Wren, it simply declined to see her. She entered a room and conversations continued as though the door had not opened. She sat at a table and no one addressed her. She walked through the east corridor and servants who had been her equals a week ago looked through her as if she had become transparent. It was not hostility, it was erasure, and I watched it happen with a cold fury that my wolf matched in kind. Wren did not flinch. That was the thing about her, she did not perform distress, and she did not perform bravery in the face of it. She moved through the keep's indifference with the same steady calm she had carried into the judgment hall. She ate her meals. She walked the corridors. She spent time in the dye works with Maren, because the old woman was the only person in Glenrath who treated her exactly as she had always been treated, and I was the second, and between us, we formed the sum total of people who looked at Wren and saw her. Orina was more precise. I encountered her once in the gallery above the judgment hall, looking down at the moonstone. It lay cold and gray in its circle of limestone, as it always did when no Luna's hand was on it. It is a beautiful artifact, Orina said without turning. I understand its history. I do not question its past. I simply observe that 300 years is a long dormancy and that a single response, however dramatic, is not the same as confirmation. The bond confirmed. Your bond, your wolf. With respect, your grace, the court needs more than your word. It needs the stone's word given publicly, witnessed by all. She turned to me then, and her expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a woman who had made her calculations and was confident in the arithmetic. If the stone answers at the Luna Rite, I will be the first to bow. You have my word on that. I will hold you to it, Lady Orina. I expect you will. She left, and I stood in the gallery and looked down at the cold stone, and felt my wolf rise restlessly and settle again. I did not doubt the bond. The melody in my chest was constant now, Wren's 4 notes, completed, running beneath every thought and every heartbeat like an underground river. But I understood what Orina was doing. She was not fighting the stone. She was fighting time. If the rite failed, if the stone, cold for 3 centuries, declined to perform on command, the court would have its excuse, and the political match would slide back into place, and Wren would be returned to the dye works as a curiosity. A story the servants told. Remember the day the stone lit up for the dye worker? Strange business. Anyway, pass the salt. I would not allow it. But the truth was that I could not force the stone to answer, and I could not command the court to believe, and the only weapon I had was the bond itself, the completed melody, the settled wolf, the certainty in my marrow that Wren was exactly who the stone had said she was. I found her in the dye works the next morning. She was elbow-deep in a vat of indigo reduction, her sleeves rolled to her shoulders, the sharp vegetal scent of the dye bath filling the low stone room. Maren sat on a stool nearby, sorting dried woad leaves with hands nearly as stained as Wren's, and the two of them worked in the companionable silence of women who have shared a craft for 20 years. Your Grace, Maren rose stiffly, shall I? Stay, Maren, I came to watch. Wren glanced at me over her shoulder. It is not very interesting. I disagree. She lifted a length of cloth from the vat. It was green, a deep, vivid green that looked nothing like the blue it would become. She held it up, and I watched the color begin to change as the air reached it. Green to teal, teal to the first whisper of blue. Then the blue deepened and deepened, and within a minute the cloth was the color of a midnight sky. The color only arrives when you trust the process, I said. Wren's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, she was not a woman who smiled easily or wastefully, but a recognition, an acknowledgement that I had listened and remembered. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." I stayed in the dye works for an hour. I learned that Wren could identify 7 shades of indigo by their reduction time. I learned that she kept a ledger of her own, a small, careful record of every formula she had tried, written in a hand as precise as Rathwell's but considerably warmer. I learned that she had a wolf, a small gray wolf, quiet and unremarkable, the kind that went unnoticed in a pack, and that when she worked, her wolf settled in exactly the way mine did when I was near her. "You know," I said as I left, "the stone did not choose you because you are extraordinary in the way the court understands extraordinary. It chose you because you are extraordinary in the way that matters." Wren wrung out the cloth and hung it on the line. "And what way is that?" "You are steady, you are honest, you see what is in front of you and you do not pretend it is something else. In a kingdom full of people who perform, you simply are." She looked at me for a long moment. The indigo cloth dripped behind her, and the light from the high window caught the stain on her hands, and my wolf hummed the 4 notes of the melody, her melody, and she said, "That is the kindest thing anyone has ever said about stubbornness." I did smile then, I could not help it. On the 5th day before the rite, Orinna made her move. It was not crude. Orinna was never crude. She simply arranged, through channels I could not trace, for a mineralogist from the university at Carden to visit Glenrath and examine the moonstone. The man, a dry, precise scholar named Doran, spent an afternoon with his instruments on the stone, and concluded publicly, in a report delivered to the council, that the quartz contained trace deposits of foxfire mineral, a naturally luminescent substance found in certain limestone formations, and that thermal fluctuation in the underground springs could, under specific conditions, cause a temporary phosphorescent reaction indistinguishable from the activation described in historical accounts. In short, Rathwell read from the report, his voice neutral, the phenomenon observed on the date in question is consistent with a geothermal event rather than a supernatural one. The council received this with the relieved murmur of men who had been handed a comfortable explanation for an uncomfortable fact. I let the murmur finish. Then I said, "Lord Rathwell, has the foxfire mineral in the moonstone ever produced a phosphorescent reaction before?" Rathwell consulted the report. The mineralogist notes that the conditions are rare. "In 300 years, has it ever glowed?" A pause. "The report does not address the historical record in that specificity, Your Grace." "I do. The stone has been examined by scholars 4 times in the past 300 years. None recorded a geothermal glow. The stone has been cold through earthquakes, floods, droughts, and the hottest summer in living memory. It lit for Wren." I looked around the table. "The Luna rite proceeds as scheduled. The mineralogist is welcome to attend." Rathwell closed the report. Orinna, standing by the window in another impeccable gown, said nothing, but I saw her fingers tighten on the sill. That evening I found Wren in the East Wing Library, a small room she had discovered on her own, filled with old volumes no one had opened in decades. She was reading a history of the moonstone, written in a mix of modern and old script, and she had a dye ledger open beside it where she was translating difficult passages. "The first Luna was a healer," she said without looking up. "Did you know that? Not a highborn, a woman who tended wolves in the valley. Aldwin found her by the river setting a broken bone in a pup's leg." I sat across from her. "I did not know that." "The stone was quarried from the riverbed where they met. He shaped it himself." She turned a page. "It was never a test of blood or rank. It was a record of the bond. The stone remembers the bond. That is all it does." She looked up at me, and her gray eyes held the same calm, cataloging attention I had seen in the judgment hall. "They can bring every mineralogist in the kingdom," she said. "The stone remembers. That is what it does." You are not worried about the right. I am terrified of the right. I will stand in front of every lord and lady in Glenrath and put my hand on a stone and ask it to speak for me. I am terrified." She paused. "But I am not uncertain. There is a difference." I reached across the table and covered her stained hand with mine. The melody rose, those 4 notes, whole and warm and resolved, and I felt her fingers curl against my palm. "You will not be alone," I said. "I know," a pause. "That is the part I am not used to." The night before the Luna Rite, my wolf would not sleep. He paced not the restless, nameless pacing of the months before, but a focused, directional pull, like a compass needle swinging toward true north. I rose from my bed, dressed, and walked the corridors, and my feet carried me to the judgment hall without my choosing it. The moonstone lay in its circle of limestone, gray and cold, the torchlight sliding across its surface. I knelt beside it, not on it, but at its edge, and pressed my hand to the quartz. Nothing. It was cold under my palm, cold as river rock, as it had been cold for every Alpha King who was not accompanied by his Luna. "I know what you are waiting for," I said to the stone. It was foolish, talking to a piece of quartz in an empty hall at 3 in the morning. But the moonstone had been placed by my ancestors' own hands, and it had remembered every Luna for 1,000 years, and I had felt its warmth under my knees when Ren touched it, and I did not feel foolish at all. "You waited 300 years," I said. "You can wait one more night." The stone gave back nothing but cold. But my wolf settled at last, and I went back to bed and slept. And in the morning the river Glen ran silver in the early light, and the apple orchards on the south slope were heavy with late summer fruit, and Glenrath was, for a moment, the most beautiful kingdom in any world. The Luna Rite was held in the Judgment Hall at the hour of the high moon. They came, all of them, every lord and lady of Glenrath's court, every council member, every ranking wolf. The gallery was full for the first time since I had begun the trials. The torches had been replaced with fresh ones, and the hall was lit gold from end to end, and the limestone carvings above the gallery rail, wolves and moons and the running river, cut by hands dead 1,000 years, caught the light and held it. Rathwell stood at his post in the gallery, ledger closed. Orina stood below, in the front rank of the court, in a gown of deep red that matched her composure. The mineralogist Doran stood beside her with a leather case of instruments. Lord Brannock, the oldest council member, had been given a chair, and he sat in it with his hands on his knees and his white head inclined toward the moonstone as though it might speak to him. I stood at the western edge of the stone circle, in the formal armor of the right dark leather and the gray wolf pelt of my line, the heavy iron chain of the Alpha's rank against my chest. My wolf was calm, utterly, impossibly calm, as though he already knew. The east door opened, and Ren walked in. She wore the pale blue gown. It fit her well, simply cut, high-necked, the fabric falling in clean lines to the floor. Someone had offered to dress her hair, and she had accepted, and it was gathered in a simple twist at the nape of her neck, and she looked like herself. Not a costume, not a performance. Ren, in a gown instead of linen, walking into a hall full of people who had spent 2 weeks deciding she was not worth seeing. Her hands were bare. The indigo stains were visible from across the hall, dark against the pale blue of the gown, marking her fingers and palms and wrists, and she had not hidden them, and she had not apologized for them, and she carried them the way she carried everything, as fact. The hall was silent. Ren crossed the limestone floor. Her steps were steady. I watched her walk, and I thought, this is the woman the stone waited 300 years for, and she is walking toward it with the same calm she would bring to a dye vat, and that is exactly why. She reached the moonstone. She looked down at it, that pale gray circle, cold and dormant, the surface catching the torchlight and giving nothing back. Then she looked at me. I nodded once. She knelt. She laid both hands on the stone, palms down, fingers spread, the indigo stains dark against the quartz. The silence was so deep I could hear the torches breathe. One heartbeat, too. The stone answered. Not the way it had answered the first time. Not a flood, not a sunrise. This time it began at her fingertips. Gold light seeped from beneath each stained finger, as though the stone were tracing the shape of her hands, learning them, confirming what it already knew. The light spread fingertip to palm, palm to wrist, wrist to the center of the disk, and then it opened, and the moonstone blazed. Gold, pure, warm, undeniable gold, brighter than the first time, brighter than the torchlight, brighter than the moon that hung above the high window. The light climbed the walls of the judgment hall and filled the carvings and turned the limestone to amber and reached the gallery and lit Lord Rathwell's face, which had gone very still, and reached Lady Orina, whose red gown looked suddenly dark, and reached Lord Brannock, who was rising from his chair with his mouth open, and reached every corner and every shadow and left no place to hide. The warmth rolled through the hall. I felt it in my boots, in the chain across my chest, in the roots of my teeth. My wolf rose not in violence, not in assertion, in joy, a quiet, bone-deep, unmistakable joy, the joy of an animal that has been waiting and waiting and waiting and has finally been answered. And I heard the melody, not in my chest this time, in the stone. The moonstone was singing. A low hum, felt more than heard, the vibration running through the limestone floor and up through the bones of every wolf in the room. The 4 notes I had carried my whole life. Wren's notes, the lyric that had been waiting for her hand. Every wolf in the court felt it. I saw it happen, a ripple of recognition, of involuntary response, that passed through the hall like wind through wheat. Wolves who had not bowed to anyone in decades lowered their heads, not because I commanded it, because the stone commanded it. Because the bond was speaking in a language older than rank or politics or the careful calculations of Lord Rathwell's ledger, and it was saying what it had always said, what the moonstone had been placed in this floor to say. She is the one. Orina's composure cracked. It was a small thing, a catch in her breath, a widening of her eyes, but I saw it, and I understood it. She had expected the stone to stay cold. She had expected the dye worker's trial to end in silence and an awkward withdrawal and the quiet restoration of the political order. She had not expected this. The moonstone burning gold from wall to wall, the entire court brought to its knees by something no mineralogist could explain, the bond singing through the stone loud enough for every wolf in the hall to hear. She looked at me. I looked at her. And then, with a grace I would not have credited her with if I had not seen it, Lady Orina of Glenrath lowered her head. Rathwell bowed from the gallery. He did not consult his ledger. He did not raise an objection. He simply bowed, and the ledger stayed closed, and the quill stayed in its case, and 300 years of silence were answered. I crossed the hall. The gold light pooled around my boots, and I walked through it, and it was warm, warm as summer, warm as the river in June, warm as the hearth wren had tended all her life. She was still kneeling on the stone, her hands pressed flat, the indigo stains glowing through the gold, and she was looking up at me with those gray eyes, and she was not crying, and she was not laughing, and she was not performing anything at all. She was simply there, steady, real, the woman the stone remembered. I knelt before her as I had the first time, and I took her hands from the stone and held them in mine, her stained, rough, indigo-marked hands, and the stone's gold light did not dim. It stayed. It held. "Wren of Glenrath," I said, and my voice carried in the silent hall. "The moonstone has spoken. My wolf has spoken. The bond has spoken. Before this court and before the stone that remembers, I claim you as my Luna, my mate, and my queen. Not because the stone chose you, because I choose you. The stone simply knew it first." She looked at our joined hands, mine pale, hers dark with dye, and she said, in that low, steady voice that had never once wavered, "I choose you, Aldrich of Glenrath, and I will not scrub my hands." A sound moved through the hall. Not a gasp, not a murmur, a sigh. The collective exhalation of 200 wolves who had held their breath and could not hold it any longer. And then Lord Brannock, the oldest member of my council, began to laugh. A warm, delighted, creaking laugh. The laugh of a man who had lived long enough to see a dead stone wake and a die worker become a queen, and who found it in the end exactly as it should be. The court followed, not the laughter, the bow. One by one the wolves of Glenrath lowered their heads, not commanded, not forced, given. The stone had spoken with a voice too old and too clear for politics, and there was nothing left to argue against. The moonstone's light settled. It did not go out for the first time in 300 years. It did not dim to gray when the luna's hands left its surface. It held a low, steady gold glow, warm as a banked fire, and it would hold that glow, I would learn, for as long as the bond endured. The stone had woken, and it did not intend to sleep again. I helped Wren to her feet. She stood in the gold light in her pale blue gown, her indigo hands in mine, and she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, not because the gown was fine, and not because the light was kind, but because she was Wren, and she had walked into this hall with her stained hands showing and her fear private and her certainty absolute, and she had trusted the process. The color only arrives when you trust the process. Rathwell descended from the gallery. He approached us, ledger tucked under his arm, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, his measured composure looked genuinely shaken. He bowed, not the efficient acknowledgement he gave to routine matters, but a full, deliberate bow from the waist. "My Luna," he said, 2 words, rationed as always, but this time spent on exactly the right purchase. Wren looked at him. "Lord Rathwell, I believe your ledger still lists me as Wren, die worker, no family name." Rathwell opened his ledger. He uncapped his quill, and in his precise, economical hand he struck through the old entry and wrote a new one. I watched him do it. The quill moved in short, certain strokes, and when he was finished he held the ledger open for her to see. "Wren, Luna of Glenrath." She looked at the words. She did not cry, but her hand tightened on mine, and the melody in my chest swelled, those 4 completed notes, her notes, the lyric that the stone and my wolf and my own heart had been carrying toward this moment for 300 years. "That will do," she said. And then, to Rathwell's everlasting surprise, she smiled at him, a full, unreserved smile, the first I had seen from her, and it was like watching the indigo cloth lifted from the vat, the green becoming blue, the hidden color arriving at last. In the weeks that followed, the court adjusted. Not smoothly, courts never adjust smoothly, but with the gradual inevitability of a river finding its new course. Wren did not try to become what the court expected a Luna to be. She attended the councils and listened and asked questions that Rathwell found uncomfortable and Lord Brannock found delightful. She kept her hours in the dye works with Marin, because the old woman was her family, and the dye vats were her craft, and she would not pretend otherwise. She read the old histories in the East Wing Library and found references to 4 previous Lunas who had been common-born: a healer, a shepherdess, a blacksmith's daughter, and a woman whose trade was listed only as the one who calms the wolves. And she copied these references into her dye ledger in the old script and said nothing about them to anyone. I found the ledger one morning on the table in her rooms, open to the page. She had written beneath the last entry, "Wren, die worker, no family name. Luna of Glenrath." And below that, in smaller letters, "The stone does not care about family names. It cares about the bond." I closed the ledger and left it where I had found it. Some truths require no commentary. Orana departed Glenrath a month after the Luna rite. She left with the same precise grace with which she had arrived, her trunks packed in an orderly fashion, her farewells efficient. She came to me before she left and said, "You were right. The stone knew." "Yes." She looked at me for a moment, and I saw something I had not expected, not defeat, but a sort of rueful respect. "She is not what I would have chosen for you," she said, "but I do not think the stone consults my preferences." "It does not." "No," she straightened her gloves. I believe I will visit my cousin in Ashford. The mountain air agrees with me. Travel safely, Lady Orina." She paused at the door. "She does not perform, Your Grace. In a court full of performers, that is either a liability or a gift. I suspect it is the latter." And she left, and the door closed behind her, and I stood in the hall and felt a knot in my chest loosen that I had not known was tied. The seasons turned. The apple orchards on the south slope dropped their fruit, and the river ran cold, and the first frost silvered the limestone walls, and the moonstone glowed gold in the judgment hall, steady as a heartbeat. Wren grew into the role in her own way, which is to say she did not grow into it at all. She was already the person the role required. The role simply had not known it yet. She mediated disputes with the same calm practicality she brought to die formulas. She tended the wolves of the pack with the same steady hand she had used on cloth and vat. She read the old histories and recovered traditions that had been forgotten, and she taught the old script to 3 young women in the lower kitchens who reminded her, she said, of herself. She never scrubbed her hands. The indigo faded slowly, as indigo does, not washing out but softening, the deep midnight lightening to a dusky blue that would take months to fully clear. By the time it did, Wren was back in the dye works, staining her fingers fresh, and Marin was laughing at her from the stool and saying, "A Luna with blue hands." Aldwin would have approved. I think he would have. The first alpha of my line had not chosen a highborn woman. He had chosen a healer by the river, a woman who set bones and calmed pups, a woman whose worth was in her hands and her steadiness, and the bond that the stone had been carved to remember. 300 years later, the stone remembered it again. My wolf no longer paced. He lay quiet and warm and still, and when Wren was nearby he hummed, a low, contented vibration that matched the moonstone's glow and the melody that had lived in my chest my whole life and now, at last, was finished. 4 notes and a lyric, her name. On the first anniversary of the Luna rite, I came to the judgment hall in the early morning. Wren was already there. She was standing at the edge of the moonstone, looking down at its gold glow, steady, warm, unwavering, the same light it had given the night it woke, and her bare feet were on the limestone and her stained hands were at her sides, and the river glen was visible through the high window, silver in the dawn. "It is still warm," she said. "It will always be warm now." She stepped onto the stone. The gold light brightened beneath her feet, the way it always did, the way it would always do, and she stood in the center of the ancient disk in her plain linen shift with her indigo hands and her gray eyes and her uncombed hair, and she was the most beautiful thing in any kingdom I had ever known or imagined, and I had not earned her. I had simply been lucky enough to carry her melody until the day she arrived to complete it. "Aldrich," she said, "come here." I went to her. I stood on the moonstone with my Luna, and the stone held us both in its warm gold light, and far below in the limestone the old quartz hummed its 4 notes, and in my chest the melody answered. Wren took my hand. Her indigo fingers laced through mine, dark and pale, stained and clean, the dye worker and the king, and she looked up at me and said, "The color arrived." I held her hand and stood on the moonstone that had waited 300 years for her touch, and I did not speak, because some things are older and truer than any word a king can say. The stone knew, the wolf knew, the melody knew. And Wren had always known. She had simply been waiting for the rest of us to trust the process.